Hi, hello.
Good morning, Brian. How are we doing today?
Hi, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're perfectly audible.
Wonderful.
So, good morning to everyone who's joined us today. We're going to be joined by lots more people very soon, but since we're on a tight schedule, we'll have to begin. I'd like to welcome you to the first edition of Back to the Future. It's a beautiful morning here in Mumbai, and I'm sure that this morning will be even more fruitful for all those of you who are participating here. Back to the Future is a one-of-its-kind speaker series where we bring together young changemakers to share their stories, their experiences, and their visions of a post-pandemic world. To me personally, Back to the Future holds immense significance. Other than the obvious pop culture reference, Back to the Future signifies the shift of the present discourse out of the past and into the future. For the last few months, all this world has been talking about is the past. We're knee deep in negativity, engaged in a perpetual blame game. What today's leaders, so entrenched in ideological wars and feats of moral supremacy, have forgotten is the long future that lays ahead. The years ahead, shaped and influenced by this pandemic, are nothing like what we could have imagined. For young individuals like me, the college experience will never be the same. For others, their first job, one that they will begin from the desk in their room, may not feel as special. Alternatively, Back to the Future holds vital significance for us. Look around you today. Who is leading talks about the future? Who is commenting and underlining their vision for the post-pandemic world? It's definitely not the youth, the primary stakeholders of this new world, replete with challenges. That's what we aim to change. We are here to take the discussion out of the past into the uncertain years that lie ahead. With the future, with young changemakers of today who have already begun to leave their mark on society around them. And they undoubtedly will be playing key roles in shaping this future, whether as policymakers, economists, artists, scientists, poets, engineers, or doctors. With that, it is my honor to introduce to you the first speaker of the Back to the Future series. Brian Wong is truly an individual to whom an introduction can do no justice. Brian is a 2020 Rhodes Scholar elect from Hong Kong for a DPhil in politics and a current MPhil in politics theory candidate at Wolfson College, University of Oxford. They graduated with first-class honors in politics, philosophy, and economics, placing 9th out of over 240 in the 2018 cohort from Pembroke College, University of Oxford, having attended on a full scholarship under the Quok Scholars Association and as a Pembroke College Scholar. Brian is the founding editor-in-chief of the Oxford Political Review, a publication that produces commentaries and interviews on political science and international relations. As the editor-in-chief, Brian has interviewed trailblazers in the field of politics, such as Noam Chomsky, Kevin Rudd, and Joseph Nye. Brian also served on the governing board of the Oxford Union, managing a budget of over £1 million. Brian is also a proficient debater and has represented Oxford internationally. They are the current debating coach of Eton College and was part of the team that coached China into winning the 2018 World Schools Debating Championship. They are also the first Hong Kong-born Chinese to advance into the open semifinals of the World Universities Debating Championship, ranking in the top 8 teams amongst 320 teams from the best universities worldwide. Brian's passions extend beyond their academic life. Brian is the founding fellow of Governance Partners Yangon, a capacity-building policy group and NGO based in Myanmar and Hong Kong. They are the vice president of Oxford Public Economists and the founding secretary of Citizen Action Design Lab, a youth-centric think tank based in Hong Kong. Brian is also a columnist for the Hong Kong Economic Journal and writes regularly for renowned publications like Time, Aeon, Times Higher Education, The Diplomat, Fortune, the South China Morning Post, Myanmar Times, SupChina, and Asia Times. I promise you, as extensive as this introduction was, it can do no justice to the multifaceted personality and genius of Brian Wong. Now, onto the young changemaker all of you are here for. Over to you, Brian.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I just want to thank you very much for that introduction. I think it was you flatter me. It's also excessive, certainly undeserved. But anyhow, hi everyone, I'm Brian, and I'm currently studying, well, I've just graduated and finished my MPhil in Oxford in politics. I'll be starting my PhD, as Harshvanan very kindly pointed out. And I think what would be useful is, instead of me talking about myself, which comes across as both self-indulgent and also very boring, I think I have a core message I'd like to share with everyone here that links kind of to the theme Back to the Future, but also, yes, to the zeitgeist of the times we live in today. And that is just one simple word: to contradict. What does it mean to contradict? You might think, well, to contradict your teacher in a classroom, to call out a classmate with whom you disagree with very viscerally and also vociferously. It might also be to break the rules, to break the law, to challenge norms and challenge codes at your school, at university, to contradict established orthodoxy and try to revolutionize academia. All of these are, ranging from the lofty to the very down to earth and immediate goals, part and parcel of what we think about and what we think of, even if we don't necessarily dare do it. And the motto I want to convey here is contradiction, whilst certainly in many ways a precedent or a cause of you being admonished, you being chastised, rejected by systems that are well entrenched, may well be a critical path towards breakthroughs and towards upsetting the status quo that then leads to innovation, that then leads to new changes and transformations to your own life and the lives of those around you. Because it is not via subservience and compliance that Martin Luther King, for instance, found a way out for civil rights amidst the incredibly hostile environment, or John Lewis as a trailblazer within a Congress, working within an establishment that prioritized excluding folks that looked like him over the basic rights and liberties of people that spoke like him. Or indeed, ranging from revolutionaries or post-independence and post-colonial heroes in West Africa, the controversial example being Nkrumah, who's a trailblazer and contradictory in his own right, transforming Western insights into something that was imbued into Ghana's post-1950s development, to examples like Sun Yat-sen in China, who brought an end to and toppled a deeply corrupt and authoritarian dynasty, the Qing dynasty, in order to breathe a fresh air into China. All of these are, in our opinions, in our folklore and common sense understanding, heroes. We never ask, perhaps, what it is that makes them heroes. We ask that, or we often think that, they're heroes because of what they did, because of their achievements, because of what they accomplished and the ensuing decades of prosperity and affluence, except in some cases it might not be that they are able to leave behind legacy of that sort. But we don't necessarily ask, what is it that made them heroic? And I think it's not to do with the exceptional intellect or what brilliant integrity, because there are loads of people with integrity out there. There are loads of brilliant geniuses, incredibly intelligent people out there, arguably more intelligent than them, that have accomplished less. But I think the central message and the central commonality as a strand that runs through all of them is just contradiction, both externally in contradicting established rules, norms, the hegemonic beliefs, the value systems, to change and transform them for the better, to agitate for disruption. But also internally, they were filled to the brim with contradictions, with forces and ideals pulling them in different directions. And that, I think, in many ways, in my opinion, is emblematic of not a leader per se, but definitely someone who makes a difference, to the world around them, given how short the amount of time we actually have on Earth. And that's really all that matters. So if there's one word and motto I'd like to kick off today's session with, it's just be contradictory. Don't be disingenuous. Don't be inauthentic. Don't pretend for the sake of pretense and also self-serving gains that, fundamentally consistency is a virtue. Don't think that way. Because ironically, and this is something that is identified and spotted by thinkers ranging from David Runciman at Cambridge to other authors like Hannah Arendt, who writes on hypocrisy in politics. Ironically, this fixation upon consistency and ideological purity is also precisely why you have individuals concealing thoughts that could actually be helpful. If leaders hiding away their internal dissatisfaction and insecurities for the sake of coming across as a strong and confident leader, to espouse that demeanor they think leaders ought to have, you have national political figures effectively saying, I'm going to stick to my principles, I'm going to stick to what I stand for or stood for 10 years ago, even though these values are outdated, anachronistic, and no longer applicable to the modern age because they are wary of contradicting themselves. We're not made, if you believe in God, or we're not born to be consistent wholes. We're not born to necessarily harmonize ourselves with the environment around us. Maybe that is how we're engineered and programmed naturally to think, but that's not, our normative mission in life. If all of us just replicate what predecessors say, do, or sort of said, did, thought, then what would be the point in talking about startups, innovation, R&D, technology? What's the point behind all of that? You don't really need incubators because all that would be incubating is a clone, right? So I think it's important to think about contradiction. Not just contradicting the past, not just embodying and embracing the present contradictions that define the human condition, but also thinking about the future, because the future is contradictory. On one hand, globalization under technical integration and also the advent of sophisticated technology, indeed surveillance technology or communication technology, globalization has brought the world ever closer. On the other hand, globalization has also exacerbated the risk and propensity for conflict in the world that we see today. From India and China to the US and China to Japan and China, well, to lots of things and China. You can see a common pattern there. That these forces, these metamorphosizing forces, are internally contradictory. Just like Facebook, just like Twitter, just like Zoom, for instance. On one hand, Zoom is brilliant in connecting people during times of COVID. On the other hand, it's led to Zoom bombing, which, trust me, I've experienced an episode of Zoom bombing, traumatized me for 3 days, and took me, well, Zoom bombing, to clarify, is not literally bombing people via Zoom. It just means, jumping onto a Zoom call and posting nude photos and pretty terrifying content. But the modern condition is, in many ways, it's constitutive, right? And it's also filled to the brim with contradictions. But don't deny it, don't reject it, don't run away from that fact. Instead, see it for what it really is. And live in it, live with it, and live it at the end of the day. So I hope that many rants that hopefully didn't resemble too much Russell Brand's rants, because I know Russell Brand's rants are pretty eclectic and also idiosyncratic in our daily discourses. People like to rant like Russell Brand. I hope I didn't rant like him. There's not a stream of consciousness. But I hope that made sense. And most importantly, if it didn't, then contradict me. Just come out here and tell me why I was wrong. I'd love to hear that. And that's perhaps how I close my introductory remarks. Thank you. Are you shocked? Are you okay? Wait, can you hear me?
Yes, Brian, you're audible. Should we begin with a few questions from my end?
Absolutely, yeah. Go.
So, my first question, you as a Rhodes Scholar will be no stranger to this question. What do you think is the future of protest groups, non-state actors like Black Lives Matter, Fridays for Future, in shaping governance and policy in a post-pandemic world?
The first thing I'd like to say is just I'm very grateful for the Rhodes Scholarship, for the opportunity. And I'd also like to flag that it's an immense privilege, and also something that I'd say I would not say it was designed or inevitable that I got it. And by no means that was the case. I think it was a mixture of luck and a combination of a variety of factors. So when you said I should be no stranger to the question, I think the reason for that shouldn't be that I'm very good at answering questions of that sort, in so much as, well, these are questions that often are lobbied and thrown out to me subsequently, because for some reason people think that when you've got this scholarship, you're someone special. That's an honor. It's an honorific, but I'm not entirely sure if I deserve that sort of honor. Anyhow, so answering your question, I'll make 3 observations here. The first is just non-state actors increasingly play a preeminent role in introducing issues to public consciousness, ranging from Greta Thunberg to Malala, to protest movements around the world, whether it be the anti-extradition bill protests in Hong Kong over the past year or so, or years or so, Black Lives Matter in the States, and also even the earlier stages of the anti-globalization and WTO protests in the 1990s, or Occupy Wall Street. All of these are movements that injected, right, at least a stream of consciousness, if not injected public awareness into core issues that afflict us today. Global warming, poverty, inequality, democratic rollback. All of these are phenomena that, had it not been for these movements, we might not have been aware of the manifestations and the forms. Regardless of what you think of these movements, regardless of how you judge or praise their appropriateness, their justification, justifiability, I think the upshot here is that movements disrupt what we think of or see as the familiar. It defamiliarizes what we take for granted, and it disrupts our discourses and what Foucault terms spontaneity, right? And spontaneous disruptions to our episteme, to our knowledge frameworks, effectively. This would only, as an effect, increase and become further entrenched over the upcoming decades. With the advent of social media, Twitterverse, Tumblr, Facebook, Instagram, but also with increasing apps that connect individuals together, WhatsApp, Telegram, these instant messaging apps, right? Social movements are likely to play a greater and greater role, and that's not a pun on greater's name, in dictating what we think is important, what we take to be urgent problems to be tackled and resolved. And a caveat I'd say before I move on to the next point is, whether or not we think these movements are accurate or precise is besides the point. The point here is that they spark discourse. How the discourse then evolves, then goes, is to some extent beyond our hands, but also something that we can participate in and control. If we're not a part of the social movement, we're still, in some way or another, bound to respond to social movements. Even if you're a climate change skeptic, you think climate change is a hoax perpetuated by the sort of Democrats, liberals out there. The fact that people are talking about it means you still have to respond to them. That's why you see so many climate change denying or skeptic papers being published, prose being platformed, right? So I think that's the first observation about these non-state actors. The second observation, this might sound slightly contradictory, or irrelevant, concerns actors that tend to operate not just beyond or independent of the state, but against the state. By that I mean terrorist groups, groups that instigate insurgency, ranging from Taliban to ISIS and all of those folks that take the form of physical terrorism, undermining and jeopardizing the lives of many, but also achieving the so-called ends through, or objectives through, means that they deem to be justified, but also cyber terrorism, bioterrorism, eco-terrorism. The rise of non-state actors is accompanied by the rise of anti-state actors, within which a significant subset, but not entirely so, constitutes individuals that adopt or practice violence as a means of achieving a political end. How do we as a political community, as a world collectively, come to terms with this phenomenon? How do we draw the line for what constitutes a terrorist or not? Because one man terrorist is another's freedom fighter, right? And the sacrifices to our civil liberties in exchange for so-called security, are they worth it? These are all questions that non-state actors have brought to the forefront of our discussion. And I think the rising phenomenon and trend of terrorism is a question that we inevitably must tackle, not through, ideally, in my opinion, hawkish and gung-ho bellicosity or unidimensional measures, right? Or draconian measures that seek to punish an entire collective of people or an entire ethnic group for the select actions of a few. I think that's disgusting. But it's also worth bearing in mind that the flip side to this naive relativism, where we attempt to justify the actions of any and all terrorist group because, they're resisting the state and the state is evil. I also must caution against that, because that sort of romanticization of violence and romanticization of immoral violence that threatens innocent civilians is absolutely abhorrent. So when balancing between state power and the overreach of the Hobbesian Leviathan, or what Asimov and Robertson term the unshackled Leviathan, balancing between that and the unconstrained and unrestrained civil society, non-state actors that practice violence. That's going to be another challenge, another theme that public policymakers and those interested in governance must tackle and combat over the upcoming decades. The final point under this is, what is the state? Back in the days, we thought, back in the eons or in the times of yore, we thought the state constituted, an empire. It constituted an emperor ruling through a feudalistic system, and that was pretty much our understanding of the state until roughly around the 16th century. And then it gradually, evolved into constitutional monarchy. If you look at the West or in China, it evolved into devolved bureaucratism, accompanying at the very top still a very strong and draconian authoritarian system ruled by dynasties and inherited throughout generations by kings or emperors, to be fair, that govern China. Fine, that's the East. But then what about Africa? What about the transition from tribalistic and very large tribalistic collectives or matrimonial societies into ones that are increasingly organized around trade, around commerce? These governance shifts also occurred around 12th to 15th centuries, but the state before then was imagined to be an empire. And non-state actors, basically, well, there were no non-state actors because the state was the people was the state. And that was effectively the core essence and ethos of the thought espoused by sort of near or medieval age and Renaissance political theorists. And then we had constitutional monarchy and a developing understanding of the bureaucracy, the Iberian bureaucracy, and all of that. Fine. Gradually speaking, we saw colonialism then, an empire take over. So it was a global projection of the empire. Who then was a non-state actor? Who was a non-state actor? Well, probably those that were excluded from the political collective decision-making processes. The slaves, the disenfranchised subjects of colonial rule. And those were individuals considered to be non-state actors, but there were no collectives associated with non-state actors then because they were not allowed to collectivize. So then you had a wave of democratization, a gradual trends of the revolution, and also factionalism within the elites leading to eventual democratization, accompanied, of course, by a dissolution of the feudalistic financial system and increasing empowerment of citizenry in that sense. So then who was the non-state actors in the 17th, 18th centuries? Maybe the civil society. Where was the civil society? Right. And then now we're moving on to the future. Don't worry, I'm going to talk about the future because that's what I was supposed to talk about there. Non-state actors will indeed undergo substantial fluctuations in their definitions, and I think this is part and parcel of the future. It's not clear where the boundaries of the state lie, especially with the rise of techno-authoritarianism and surveillance technology, as well as the Internet of Things. And you might think these are buzzwords, they probably are, but they're also tools by which the state could control and monitor individuals' behaviors and speech. CF the PRISM, CF, Edward Snowden's whistleblowing for America, CF the NSA, CF the great country up north. All of these, right, are manifestations and forms of state overreach, we think now, but in 10 and 20 years' time, maybe we'd think it's state reach. And then in 40 years' time, we might think it's state underreach. So the boundaries between non-state and state are fragile, are capricious, and it falls upon us to defend the civil society against the encroachment of structures that may not be accountable or checked against. So I hope that answer wasn't too long, but I hope that also gave you sort of my thoughts on the issue.
I'd just like to ask you, you spoke about the intersection of the state and the non-state, as the years have been going by. And I'd just like to ask you, I think all of us know that China has an entire armada of non-state actors with which it, propagates its charm offensive throughout the world. Now, in a post-pandemic world, where most of the nation's economies were ruined, healthcare systems are overworked, where they can't resist Chinese pull, what do you think are going to be the ramifications of an increasing Chinese charm offensive?
Well, I think the first observation is to say it's not working very well for China, right? I wrote about mass diplomacy way back in March, and that was, April, sorry. And that was because I thought, there's a clear charm offensive here, and you can call me a cynic, but I think it's very clear that there's a power play here. That's a delivery of medical supplies, masks, all of that has a lot to do with the fact that China's trying to rehabilitate its international image. And I think the ramifications of this charm offensive are not going to be that apparent because it's not succeeding for a variety of reasons. One, cultural incongruences between what is propagated and the listeners that are receiving the messages. If you come up to me and say, you must buy my product today or else I will no longer charm you, I don't think that's particularly charming. So to start off with, we can note that the charm offensive struggles because it doesn't understand the parlance and the languages or the mentality and mindsets of recipient countries. Secondly, the charm offensive would mean nothing in the absence of concrete hard power benefits. If it were the case that the charm offensive is accompanied by genuine advancements to the recipient's structures of, say, economic operations or trade or commerce, then I'm sure the charm offensive would be far more efficacious in that case, right? Because at the very least, there's substance to go along with it. But at the moment, it comes across as more a PR firm, a very expensive PR firm operation. That's not going too well. And the third reason is precisely that if you think of Jacoby's analogy or description of a cultural war in America in 2014, the world is undergoing a cultural war right now. Yes, it is in many ways true that America is imperialist, that it is still the case that Hollywood and all of these other cultural hegemons and icons are dominating our understanding of what morality is, of our conceptions of heroes, that indeed Bollywood is named for some reason or another in the same vein as Hollywood, right? And that narrativization that centers around the West, yes, that's worrying, undeniably. But we must also worry about, and I say that as someone who believes firmly that countries benefit the most when they work together as opposed to against each other. We must also worry about the bellicose and also deeply acrimonious strand of nationalism that we see arising from and coupled with the mass diplomacy efforts. If it's just a beneficent or largely beneficent and altruistic donation of mass and medical supplies, I think the world would embrace it. But the question here is where not, as a country, China could convince the world that it is altruistic or broadly altruistic and decouple these narratives of nationalism and Chinese supremacy from the efforts internationally. So I think these are three reasons why I'm not convinced that this charm offensive worked, which means that speculating on its implications would be a tad redundant, I suppose, because it's kind of like speculating on where not you think, when thinking about putting a Gyarados in Pokemon Go against a Charizard, you know that the fire would always lose out to water. So the question isn't so much, okay, how many HP would you have left, but would you win in the first place, right? So I would always say, don't ask if Charizard would survive the attacks of a water-type Pokemon. Ask instead, when the battle finishes. So I think that's my answer there. Another word to note is, I think it's saddening and also maddening that individuals who try and preserve normal bilateral relations between superpowers and large powers are increasingly disillusioned with the simple fact that hawks and those who are keen to go to war, those who are keen to go to economic war with one another, those who are keen to instrumentalize tragedies and crises for political gains, and I'm looking at everyone here, it's both frustrating and also regretful that hawks are now increasingly directing discourses from both sides of the Pacific. And when that's the case, right, it leaves very little room for maneuvering for those who want to see democratic change and liberalization and progress without entering into another Cold War. So that's my 2 cents. Sorry if it sounds a bit somber.
Brian, I'm sure our audience has a lot of political questions for you, but I'm going to ask you a few personal questions if you don't mind. So at this time, I think we'll open up the chat box to start so the audience can start asking questions. In the meanwhile, I'll finish my last 2 questions with Brian. So Brian, I'd like to ask you, the post-pandemic world, the job market is shrinking right now. People are being put out of their jobs. Young people are just so uncertain about their future at this point. What do you feel that you are doing right now to adapt to this post-pandemic world, something that young people can take inspiration from?
I think a cool part of the adaptation process, and I don't think I've succeeded, mind you, so I'm going to put off I'm going to come in with a bit of a downer here right off the bat. I don't think I've succeeded necessarily in adapting and adjusting. We're all struggling, right? The pandemic is hopefully a one-in-a-lifetime experience, and not in a good way. It's hard to make sense of where and how we should stand and how we should adjust to it. And the first comment I'll make is no one should feel the pressure or feel that under any strict obligation to adjust and adapt swiftly. It's difficult. Let's face and sit on that fact for the moment. It's difficult. But then the question comes, what can we do when it's so difficult? First, we might look towards digitalization of our operations, but that's, again, not something that's necessarily accessible and available to all of us, to all of you, right? Alternatively, we can think of potentially sacrificing the desire for mobility, the desire for international travel, and just moving into a more sedentary lifestyle, one that's about consolidating your weaknesses and reflecting upon, indeed, what you need to work on the most. Taking a pause, a momentary break, right? But finally, in terms of adjustment, and this is perhaps the closest I'll give or be able to offer to like an actual piece of advice. Think about others and be more compassionate. How would they feel if they were on, how would you feel, if you were on the other end of your treatment? How would you feel if you were them? We like to maintain this strict us versus them cut with this imagination or this conviction, right? That fundamentally we're not them, we're different, we're better, we're superior. But are we? You know? And that's why it's difficult. And it's, I think, impossible to balance everything at times of the pandemic to respond to Nvidia. And that, I think, is my overarching response, really.
I'm sure you've given this a lot of thought, but after you finish your DPhil, where do you plan on working? I know for a fact that you will be involved in some aspect of political life, but what do you feel the challenges will be for young people like you and me interested in working in politics in this post-pandemic world?
Working in politics is incredibly difficult in light of, the current political climate that we see around the world. When you work in politics, you have to take sides. I think that's unfortunate. I think it's unfortunate because fundamentally what solves or resolves issues is not about taking sides. It's about finding commonalities. It's about bridging gaps and differences. These might sound like empty rhetoric. I genuinely believe in them. You can call me an idealist, but I really think so. But when you move into politics, politics changes you. It renders you corrupted or corruptible at the very least by forces beyond your control. It transforms the way you think. It means that you have to pick factions, pick parties, pick a group of people you can count on. And if you can't count on them, then you lose out effectively on the only capital and only resources that enable you to make a difference in the world. And that, I think, is the underbelly, the not so glorious sides of politics. Politics can help fix problems that afflict everyone in a society. It can be a very noble mission and noble task, but at the very same time, it can also be a devastating mission, a chaotic enterprise, an enterprise that's doomed to fail before it's even started. So when we go into politics, it's not just about changing the world for the better. That's something that you might be taught and told from watching all of these movies about inspirational political figures. But it's also about the compromises. It's also about understanding. It's also about adapting and adjusting to the constraints that real life would throw upon you. And how do you adapt? How do you adjust? Do you adjust? Can you succeed in doing so? Question mark. So these, politics is filled to the brim with uncertainty. I'm not kidding you here, right? And that's why, in my opinion, there's no easy answer. There's no easy way out. But if you want it, if you want to achieve it, go for it. Stick to it. Fight it. Fight it until you can't. And then still fight it more. Fight it harder. That's probably my thought there.
That was beautiful, Brian. That's all I can say. That was really beautiful, and I personally was very touched by what you said. I think to bring us to the last segment of today's talk, the questions from the audience. The first question: what do you think of the phrase "eat the rich"?
They don't taste very nice. In all honesty, I think, this is my 2 cents. Promoting class antagonism and also class struggles is not just a relic of the past. Maybe it's not a relic of the past. Ironically, it still happens today. But it doesn't work. It doesn't work that way. You eat the rich, and where comes the money? You eat the rich, and where goes the support? You eat the rich. Why would the rich not want to eat you? If it's the status quo that the rich wants to eat you but hasn't decided they want to swallow you or just, dice you up and then prepare you as diced cubes, then when you want to eat the rich, they're going to eat you as diced cubes of the poor, of the middle classes. But also secondly, have you got friends who are rich? Do you know people who are rich? Because some of them you just don't understand. We can't understand how the rich think. But others you can. It's about finding commonalities then. It's not about eating all of them. It's about eating strategically. Persuading those who can't be persuaded. Working with those who are sympathetic. Don't eat them. You can't eat all of your allies. This fixation upon ideological purity, upon a monolithic conception of what the right way to practice, politically correct socialism is, I find that troubling. Because that is not outcome driven. It's driven instead by impassioned, impetuous outbursts. And I can do that too. I can also engage in that outburst. I can talk like someone who wants to eat the rich because the rich is unjust, to be rich is immoral, is fundamentally exploitative. All of these slogans I can say. But I wouldn't, because I don't think that's helpful. So don't eat the rich. I'd say you should eat, definitely eat some dim sum. If you're a fan of dim sum, it's where my home, Hong Kong, where I come from, dim sum's pretty damn popular here. So yeah, go for dim sum. Don't eat the rich. Yeah.
I think that was a brilliant answer, Brian. Moving on to our next question, we have quite a few questions about China, so I think I'm going to club them into one sort of comprehensive question.
I guess you can say your China clumped them together. Excuse the pun. Was that funny? No.
A bit, to me.
Okay, thank you. Great. I thought it was funny too.
So we had one question about, China's island building in the South China Sea and China's debt trap diplomacy. And on the other side, we had a question about the anti-China frenzy that's overtaken this world today. What are your 2 takes on Chinese debt trap diplomacy, China engaging in more and more debt traps today vis-a-vis the anti-China frenzy that's overtaken the world?
I think either end, pro-China frenzy or anti-China frenzy is dangerous. And I know when I say this, and as I've always been accused of, I'll be accused of being a lukewarm centrist, but it's true. Blind, zealous support for China, nationalistic jingoism, people coming out in droves waving a red flag. I mean, I don't need to be Indian to know that it just feels pretty damn irritating. CF, what's going on currently in the north of India, Indo-China border. It's pretty damn alarming, right? It's unsettling to see such express manifestations of an ideology that prioritizes one country, one ethnicity, as the correct one, as the so-called superior one. But let's not forget, though, that there are loads of flaws and defects in China that we need to be able to criticize and call out. We need to call it out with tact, call it out with strategic viability, that you can survive still within an increasingly toxic environment. You have to call it out, not just through speech or writing about it, but through action. However, and this is something I do agree with fundamentally with a lot of my friends in Oxford and whatnot. Let us not take reasons to oppose China, legitimate ones, as grounds therefore to support the dog whistling racism. perpetrated by far-right nationalists in America. I've seen folks say that they would support Pompeo. They love Pompeo, allegedly, because he's opposing China. I wanted to raise, what about Pelosi? What about Biden? They all oppose China. I don't see you fawning over them. Right, at the end of the day, let's not forget that the anti-China dog whistle is also a phenomenon and a cause of much pain and agony for many individuals. Folks that look like us, like me, in America today. Anti-China frenzy isn't devastating because of its impact on the so-called political echelons, the upper echelons rather, of the Chinese state. It's devastating because of its impacts on ordinary civilians, on citizens that look Chinese, on Chinese migrants, on those who have struggled for decades to make a living in a country where their names are mispronounced, where their citizenships are not recognized, and where the workers denigrated as stealing the jobs of the locals. I think that is despicable. So let's call out political structures and call out government abuses in a way that's strategic and tactful and achieves the desired ends, but not do so at the expense of individuals that are innocent and should be decoupled from the actors of particular structures or the actions of political structures in that sense. So I think that's, a lukewarm centrist take, you might say, but I think it's a fair take. It's reasonable to say that you can have opposition and harbor resentment and reasonable criticisms without conflating that with mindless ruses, lies, meretricious lies, and ploys designed to turn numbers and turn heads, literal heads, figureheads, individuals into casualties of a conflict that they cannot control, they cannot decide, and they have no role in sustaining. So that's my take there.
Brian, we have time for one last question. I noticed a question that would feel very close to home for you, so I'd like to ask you that one. Let's talk about the new security laws in Hong Kong. Do you think that the Chinese Communist Party is giving human rights to the people of Hong Kong, or what do you think is the entire mission behind their possible annexation of Hong Kong?
Well, to be entirely clear, Hong Kong has always been a part of China, and I don't think it's necessarily human rights that are compromised here. But I think there will indeed be a rollback to political and civil liberties as a result of this law. To the Chinese government terms, a very small part of the population, I would flag that it's, at the end of the day, it's worth bearing in mind that what's happened in Hong Kong, what's happened very close to home, is the product of a series of incredibly unfortunate events. It's a combination of both Beijing's feeling that Hong Kong is out of control and has become, for some bizarre reason, and well, not bizarre reasons, in their opinion, they think we are the hot spot for foreign insurgency. We all know, and I know that from talking to my friends, that we're not foreign spies or agents. We're just people who want to live ordinary lives in Hong Kong under a democratic and accountable government. We want better governance. We want reforms in the system. We just want to see a government that works for the people. So I don't think it's insurgency or any sort of that crap that people think will make it out to be. And concurrently, from the protest movement side and from the pan-democrat side, this is the result, and the events of the past year, the result of a mixture of factors: electoral considerations to do with the rather stifled and slow pace of democratization in Hong Kong over the past decades, 20 years, but also fundamentally with distrust. And this is tragic. It is tragic in a sense that this distrust may not be necessarily the fault of any of these parties alone. And I'm not saying this to excuse the pandemics, excuse the government, or excuse the Chinese government. I'm just noting the fact that it's a Greek tragedy, and everyone played a part. So what's happened in Hong Kong today, it might restore superficial order and so-called stability. But a core part of Hong Kong is about its pluralism, its ability to embrace diverse values, a diverse range of opinions and beliefs and understandings of the world that can conflict and clash. And that's what makes Hong Kong beautiful. I think a Hong Kong that loses that, if that were to be the case under this new law, it would be tragic. It would be poignant to see Hong Kong descend that way. But I'm more hopeful. I'm more hopeful not necessarily because of macroscopic reasons. I'm more hopeful because I fundamentally believe in the versatility and the dexterity of the Hong Kong people. That our culture and our values and our upbringing and our backgrounds, our internationalism and our exposure to the world at large, these are what make us so lovable. And when we're caught in between two superpowers in the new Cold War, the life and the story of Hong Kong is the story of 7 million people, of 7.4 million people that must decide and find their place, struggle to find their place in this storm, in this gathering storm, if I may borrow from Churchill's words, in this gathering storm, whose trajectory we have very little control. But whether or not we weather this storm, it's not just up to us. It's up to the mercy of fate. And ultimately, we depend on the kindness of strangers. To cite one of my favorite plays, A Streetcar Named Desire. Thank you very much.
I think to end, this was a beautiful way to end, depending on the kindness of strangers and what you said earlier, being more compassionate individuals. I think that's something that will really dictate how the future of this world plays out, how the younger generations take the responsibility onto themselves to not make the same mistakes that our ancestors and forefathers have made across centuries, but rather to almost evolve and see this world in a new light, respect the earth, respect what the earth gives us. And I think ultimately it comes down to that, honestly. So I'm sorry we can't take any more questions, but Brian is actually on a very tight schedule, and I'm very grateful that Brian took the time out of that extremely busy day to speak here today. Your talk was inspiring, it was insightful, and it made me see so many facets of politics and of the world ahead that I possibly would not have thought of. A big thank you to our audience here today who've taken this ride back to the future with us. Thank you all for attending what proved to be a very enlightening morning. And again, thank you so much, Brian, for taking time out of your schedule to be here with us.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Brian. And ladies and gentlemen, members of the audience, we have our next speaker on the 8th of August. We have a very exciting speaker planned for all of you. So I hope all of you attend that talk too. Brian, is there anything you'd like to conclude with for the audience?
No, not at all. I just want to say, for those of you who are considering applying for Oxbridge, feel free to let me know. Happy to chat about informal advice and also the hurdles along the way. And that's about it. Thank you all and goodbye.
Thank you, Brian. I'm going to take you up on that offer very soon.
All good. Take care. Bye.
Bye. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everyone. We've now concluded the first session of the Back to the Future speaker series. We look forward to seeing all of you and many more of you on the 8th of August. Thank you.